it's Peter Downs here from the Inclusion Club. Welcome to this second part of a two-part little mini-series around the tree framework, and today we're going to look at growing our tree skills a little bit more. I'm also going to be helped again by my little naked gender-neutral waving person here who's going to help us through this presentation. Quick recap from the last episode. We went through an explanation of the tree framework. This is a tool to help us find ways to adapt and modify activities to make them more inclusive. It's a mindset, if you like, or a way of thinking. We noted that adapting is often easier for people with a physical disability and sensory impairment. Now, this is because people with physical and sensory impairment often bring with them the prosthetics that help the inclusion process. By that I mean a wheelchair, for example, or a prosthetic limb, or a hearing aid. You can often see where the disadvantage lies, so you're more able to do something about it. You can see better for a person with physical and or sensory impairment than you can for a person with an intellectual disability where the disadvantage is. Therefore, you're able to do more about it. But, as I just said, for people with an intellectual disability, it is harder to see where the disadvantage lies, and they do not bring with them the kind of prosthetics that others do. Now, one of the most frequently asked questions over the years has always been, how do I adapt and modify activities for people with an intellectual disability? So we're going to look at that today, particularly the T in tree teaching style. It's best to do the hard stuff first, I guess, and then the easier stuff is, well, easier. Let's consider first a few variables of the activity situation, things that we often take for granted as a teacher or coach. Such as, we assume that people have good attention to task. We assume that people always learn from experience. We assume that people are able to discriminate easily between tasks. And finally, we assume that people have good generalization skills, meaning that when we teach a skill or activity in one situation, it will automatically be transferred to another situation. Now, in a moment, we're going to look at some adaptations to address these assumptions. But first, let's just consider a bit of teaching theory. Now, just a bit here, it just helps us put this into a little bit of context. Consider two educational theories. Now, these are very, very well established. Constructivism and instructivism. Constructivism is a learning theory based on the idea that each individual learner constructs his or her own knowledge. Therefore, constructivism is student-based. This is primarily what you find in schools today. Instructivism, on the other hand, is a learning theory based more on teacher-directed learning, meaning that instructivism is more teacher-based. In reality, of course, for groups of people that includes people with an intellectual disability, there is a balance that needs to be struck between a constructivist and an instructivist approach. Instructivism is used in special education circles a lot because students with an intellectual disabilities do not have the cognitive hardware to construct their own learning in the same way. So, this is important as teachers and coaches. We must construct learning for people with an intellectual disability a lot more than for people without an intellectual disability. We must also abandon some of the regular assumptions that we make about how we teach and coach. This is when we come back to the term cognitive prosthesis that we used in the past episode. These prosthetics are tools, if you like, will help us facilitate inclusion into sport and physical activity. These prosthetics, these teaching strategies and tips are what we can use to help facilitate inclusion for people with an intellectual disability. So, let's have a look at some of these tools based on the four assumptions we talked about earlier. I guess you could call these teaching tips. We assume that people have good attention to task. Well, you can use the rule of 3. This means breaking tasks down into 3 component parts and repeating those parts before moving on. To give you a very simple example, let's take the example of taking a penalty kick in football. 1. Step back from the ball and prepare to kick. 2. Decide which corner of the goal you're going to kick the ball. 3. When ready, kick the ball into the corner of the goal. Now there may be multiple tasks involved in that particular task, but you have simplified the action and objective into 3 different parts. You must also check for understanding. This is where we look for visual, auditory and kinesthetic clues that component parts are understood. This could be something simple like a nod, a yes, or simply the action of kicking the ball. Also, let's minimize distractions. This is really important. So we're keeping instructional environments consistent, clear, and discrete. Over time, try to keep the instructional place the same in terms of how they are ordered, structured, and organized. Be consistent in how instruction is delivered and keep unnecessary distractions, such as unused equipment, out of sight. Let's have a look at the second assumption. We assume that people learn from experience. Well, we can use visual prompts. These can be things, very simple images, such as different types of balls, different types of targets, depictions of the actual game itself, or people playing the game, pieces of equipment such as balloons, and different types of balls to depict what's going to happen. Now these can be simple symbols or images, and this sort of technique is used widely in special education circles to depict an activity that's you're going to do. So, for example, if you're going to do a basketball type activity, use a basketball picture to depict that kind of activity. We assume that people are able to discriminate between tasks, so why don't we discriminate more between tasks? Where appropriate, ensure component parts are in the right order and you focus on what is important. Also, strategically isolate tasks. Take individual component parts and teach them in different environments. Let's have a look at the assumption. We assume that people have good generalization skills. So, teach in natural settings. Use the appropriate settings, a football field for football or a gymnasium for gymnastics. So try to teach in the most natural settings as possible. And finally, incrementally implement changes. Teach skills and activities in similar but different settings, different games using the same skills. Teach skills and activities in similar but different settings, so different games using the same skills. For example, do not only practice kicking a football during football games. Develop other games that require kicking. So to recap, your cognitive prosthetics, or the tools that you can use, or if you like, teaching tips are: use the rule of 3. Check for understanding. Minimize distractions. Use visual prompts. Discriminate between tasks. Strategically isolate tasks. Teach in natural settings. And incrementally implement changes slowly over time. Now, you may be thinking, these are common sense and simply examples of good teaching practice. And you'd be right, of course they are. But when working with groups that include people with an intellectual disability, they become very important to get right, and they can make a huge difference to inclusion. The point here is that they are easy to overlook and it's easy to become complacent, but inclusion, particularly for people with an intellectual disability, can hinge on how well you implement these cognitive prosthetics. So thank you very much for watching this. We're going to leave it there from me and my gender neutral little white guy here. I hope that's given you a bit more of an explanation of the tree framework and how you can use it to adapt to modify activities for people with an intellectual disability. So thanks for watching.